cut down on other apps. And each group, panel group will take 20 minutes, and then we'll have a transition. They'll introduce themselves, and then you can put questions in the chat, and I will ask them in the few minutes that we have at the end. So I'm going to turn it over now to Melanie and Emily. Welcome.
Just Melanie. Emily is not, unfortunately, was not able to be here today, but I'm excited to do this presentation for us. So I'm going to share my screen. I say that I'm going to, but sometimes it doesn't always work. So what I'm excited about for this presentation is that it is almost the culminating kind of experience in teaching writing that I've been having for 30 years. I started teaching in 1989. So I feel very both young and excited by the work that I'm seeing at this conference, but also I'm feeling the 30 years of teaching sometimes, particularly after this year. So our big goals for this session, Emily and I, was we wanted to talk about the big questions that were starting to emerge from our pre-service and in-service teachers that we worked with. And then we want to talk about how we really shifted some of their questions into thinking about how they were talking about connecting reading and writing and thinking. And then I also want to talk about the ways in which mentor texts become part of it. And then I've got some examples to show you. So when I started teaching, one of the things that I noticed was that the books that I read that were part of the required curriculum were very much books that my students read and engaged with as readers, but not necessarily as writers, even though we were often asking them to write about. And it wasn't until I taught my first young adult novel, which was, to continue the theme of the day, The Chocolate War, that my students really decided that reading and writing were things that they could connect together. And they were so passionate about the Chocolate War that they wrote and they wrote and they wrote and they rewrote scenes, they added dialogue, they wrote poetry, they did all of these things. And so from that point on, young adult literature was, for me, a way into both reading and writing for my students. And then as I taught more, it also became a pathway into thinking critically about text, thinking critically about the world around them. And so when I see these questions from my teachers, how do I use young adult novel when the Common Core doesn't allow for us to use those kinds of texts? How do I use mentor texts for writing when I have other texts that I have to use to teach literature? Where do I fit in the skills that my students need if I have to teach both novels and writing? And then my students hate poetry. Why should I use verse novels? And as always, when I see these questions, one of the things that I say to my students is, let's think about ways that we can potentially reframe the question. Does the CCS actually require that you use particular text? How can you make the text that you're teaching also mentor text? How can you think about the skills that can build across reading and writing and thinking, and then connect all of your things together? And then, do students actually hate poetry, or do they hate the way that we teach it? And so often when I first started working with pre-service teachers and I would have them use verse novels, they did the same things with the verse novels for young adult literature that they did with the verse and poetry that we were teaching in class. And it often, as much as the students might have liked the poetry, it often shut down the student writers. And so what changed is when we shifted to thinking about poetry poetry differently. One of the challenges in our current curriculum here in Nashville, which is where I'm located, I'm at Vanderbilt University, is that there's been a narrowing of some aspects of the curriculum. And so poetry for us became a window of bringing in much more diverse literature for our teachers. It was also something where we could concentrate on very powerful texts that did something for students. We could do it as bell ringers, we could do it as connective tissue, we could do all kinds of things with it. So the time management, both for students as readers and writers, became much more manageable. And the size for students, when I would go in to do a workshop with them, it was much less intimidating because it was a single page, and it was a single page with a lot of white space. And also there are a lot of components of what the skills and things that we're expected to teach in our literature classes that poetry meets those requirements. So it does a lot of different things for us. Poetry, there's also a lot of multiple ways that you can use the same text. It can be a model. It can provide different ideas around structure. It can also be a tool for analysis. It often shows multiple uses of language. And when you're looking at novels in verse, which is where that we're pulling all of this poetry from that we're talking about today, it's both part of the story and also often a standalone piece. And for some of these poems, they can be scaffolds into other poems that are very similar. And then it's often, because we don't necessarily have time to teach the entire novel in verse, it often serves as an advertisement or a gateway to these texts. So we also firmly believe that poetry is incredibly powerful language. There's something about the intensity of the moment that the poetry provides that touches readers, that grabs them. It's something that lives in spaces in their reading that they don't necessarily see until they suddenly have these connections. So as a teacher, and I told you I've been teaching for 32 years now, one of the things that I learned early on as a participant in the writing project and as a writer was that mentor texts are very powerful for ways in which you can use them. The National Writing Project defines mentor texts as pieces of literature that you, both the teacher and the student, can learn from, that you can return to them and you can reread them for multiple purposes. They are texts to be studied and imitated. They can help students see how to take risks, see how to try things out. And so that's really very powerful and very important for young novice writers. And so as a teacher early on, one of the first teacher mentors that I discovered through books was Katie Wood Ray. And even though I taught middle school and high school, and her book was for elementary students, there was something very powerful in the way that she was talking about teaching writing to her students. And so one of the tools that I picked up from her was this idea of keeping track of the craft that you were seeing in the author's work, pulling out something, trying it out, naming it, coming up with things, figuring out what was the purpose, why did the author want to use it, and then coming up and having students write personal examples. As I've read continually in these things, I found other writing mentors. Image Grammar does the same thing for grammar that a lot of mentor texts do for different types of writing. If you haven't discovered Allison Marchetti and Rebecca Odell, Beyond Literary Analysis is one of their books, but they also have several more on using mentor texts in the classrooms, and they have some really great models that a lot of teachers are starting to adapt, and they're very much built on the idea of reading it as a reader, identifying craft elements, thinking about them as writers, trying them out, connecting to other texts, doing things, but trying them out. So this is the model of a lesson plan, or thinking about a lesson plan, that I use with my in-service teachers and my pre-service teachers. So we start with a question, not what text are you going to teach, but what are the skills, concepts, techniques, or disciplinary terms or practices that you want to teach? And that we pull from the Common Core and the standards and whatever learning goals have been established. And once we have that, then we ask the question, what are the texts or texts that will help you do this? And so we pick mentor text. And then we think about, okay, as a reader, what is this strategy that's part of this? As a writer, what are the techniques that the writer uses? As a thinker, what are the disciplinary practices do I recognize? And we start to think about that as both a teacher and a writer. We try to keep them having all of these hats on at the same time. And then we move into how do reading, writing, and thinking work together, because that lets you start putting together a unit or a unit plan or a lesson plan, because you can start seeing how these texts can support each other and how these mentor texts can be used in multiple ways within the same lesson. And then we start thinking about, what do students need to do in order to try things out? So we look at, and we start with Brown Girl Dreaming, usually with our mentors, with our mentor teachers, because this is one that is now part of our curriculum. And so we start with the questions. As a reader, what do you notice? What does this make you think of? How does it help you make sense of the poem? And thinking about what do you notice is an open question. Students notice something. And we start having them underline and think about, and then we have them share. So this is an example from a recent activity with middle school students. So you notice that they're starting to pick up on the language. They may not have the name for things, and that's okay because those are things that we can teach them. But we start with the idea that they know something and they can identify something, and we're starting to think about the ways in which it can be incorporated. And we keep talking and we keep them thinking about it, and we have them share, and then we start having them create. You know, what is it that they're doing? Do we know, is there already a name for this? If there is, what is it? And how do we help ourselves remember it? And then who else do we know that does this? And then how do we help create this? And then we write. And so one of the tools that we use when we're doing something like this, because we're going to, for this particular activity, we decided to have them write about the day they were born. And then so we ask them, what are the questions that you need to ask yourself before you write? So this is the student generated list. It's they're looking at it based on what's in the poem. So they're going back to it as a reader, starting to try to figure things out. And then they're thinking about, well, what else do they need to know? And then they start figuring out, what is it about? And so we're going back to it as a reader and as a thinker, and then we're coming back to it again as a writer. And then they write. And so this is one from our mentor teachers. And they're starting to look at it as a model, and they start and they replicate familiar patterns, and then they come back to it. Often for students, we will do things called one-liners. It's where when we pick a line that we think is particularly powerful, and then we have them write as a model, and the students are the ones who pick the line to model it after. So here's some examples from a middle school class. So looking at these texts, we can also use them to provide structure. Pattern poetry provides rules for writers to follow. Some writers wholeheartedly embrace the rules. Other writers find them confining. And then, so we do the same thing with different patterns. So this is a really complicated pattern that we're looking at. And this is the pattern. It has very specific use of repetition. Lines are repeated. So all the stanzas have 4 lines. The speaker is an inanimate object who observes an event. So we have them pick an inanimate object in the class. What do you think that pencil sharpener or that desk or that book sees from day to day? And how can we write about it? And then we use this as a model for it. And this is from October Morning. One of the things that teachers noticed as they started doing this is that as they started incorporating small bites of poetry into their classrooms to help them think about things, is that ideas from the poems or the structures of the poems started creeping into their students' work. And one of them noticed that her students had haiku that were in the margins of their essays. And that was after they had been working with Death Coming Up the Hill. And one of the things that Death Coming Up the Hill did was it made students willing to play with haiku in the form of haiku. So here are some of the ones that creeped into writing journals and into the margins of different essays. One of my favorites is sometimes it's the words that aren't there, the words in the blank white emptiness of the page that tell the parts of the story that matter most of all. And that was in the margins of an essay on, I can't remember which book, but I think it might have been The Great Gatsby. So we're looking at Death Coming Up the Hill, and that's a lot about writing about history. And so this is a very powerful text that happens. And so one of the things that we do is we look at an event that happens or particular days or things that are going on. And we have the students write about events. And so each time there's been some sort of big historical event that's happened, we've written something. And we did it as classroom teachers, both Emily and I, but also we do it now, and we do it when we go into schools. So we have the students do pre-writing where they choose an event, they complete a graphic organizer, and then we decided that instead of having the students write the entire poem themselves, that we would do a round robin kind of writing. So here's an example. This was on the Parkland shooting. The students do the research, they find article links, and then we complete this graphic organizer and they conclude these things. And then they write a collaborative haiku. And so here are the directions for what they do. And then they create a haiku that's been written by all 5 members of the group. And as a writer, you do the first and the last one as the person who brings it to the group. And what we noticed as students were reflecting on their writing was that they said that they had a greater sense of what it meant to consider transitions, to consider the movement of ideas through something, because they were building on what somebody else had done. And so we've also learned that poetry can be a tool for analysis. So we started with Mirror, Mirror and Echo, Echo, which are books of poetry for young children. And they are reverse poems. So if you read the poem down one direction, it tells one particular way, and then the reverse of the poem gives another perspective. And so we've done this multiple times with students, middle school, high school students, and I've worked on it with doctoral students when they're struggling with their research. So there's also Echo, Echo. Echo does the same thing that Mirror, Mirror does for fairy tales. It does it with mythology. So as we were reading, Tyler Johnson was here, students read, and then they wrote the 2 different perspectives. And if you'll notice, the lines reverse, and almost every word is the same. Same with, this was, I Am Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter. And so we've got the 2 perspectives from Xiomara and the one from her mother. And so what we noticed was that students were, even though they ended up eventually also writing essays about these things, doing the pre-writing as poetry gave them more insight into their characters. And I'm talking really fast because I'm trying to get through all of these, but we also used poetry as a scaffold. Sonnets were scary. They were scary at first. So we read books that used them. So we read A Wreath for Emmett Till. And it is by Marilyn Nelson, and it is heroic crown sonnet, so that there are patterns in how it happens. So it's a structure. So it's told in sonnet form. There are 15 sonnets. They are interlinked, like the last line of one is the first line of the next one. And so all of these things happen, and it becomes this incredibly powerful story that's told in a very structured form. And students first were really scared that it was going to be too hard for them to read and understand. And for a long time, we debated whether we should identify that they were sonnets. And so we did it both ways with students, and the students responded the same way, whether we identified it as sonnets or not. And I don't know that we have time. I was going to have you look at an activity. I do have materials and notes that I will drop in the chat, but we're not going to do this activity. But one of the first things that we do when we start with a poem with students is we start with what you notice. And so one of our students said in our study, the teacher asked me to tell what I noticed. I can do that. I don't always know what things are called. It's harder when the teacher starts with, where's the metaphor, something like that. So the discussion started with what I noticed and what y'all noticed, and then we tried stuff out. Then we wrote bigger stuff. And the idea that poetry can lead to writing more and more and more was very powerful for us. And then another student said, I thought the poetry we started out with was not real poetry because it wasn't using big words and stuff like that. It was poetry that I hear in music or in other places. It wasn't like school poetry that feels like something written 1,000 years ago. And so what we've noticed as we've worked across our programs and across the students that we work with, Emily and I both work with pre-service teachers, we work with in-service teachers, and we work with students in classrooms still. And so what we want is for students to write, and however we can get students to write, that's what we want to do. And what we have found over the past few years, really concentrating on this, is that poetry provides very powerful mentor text for students. Thank you.
Melanie, that's perfect timing. And thank you. Thank you so much for your ideas and for offering to share your slides in the chat, because people have been begging for them. So you know that your ideas will be used in lots of our classrooms coming up. I'm going to turn this right over now to Bryan and Susan.
Sorry, I'm typing it. I'm still in chat mode.
Melanie, that was a perfect segue for us, my National Writing Project sister.
Melanie with the great red hair, Susan with the great red hair, and people probably don't know this, but Sharon, Kane, and I went to preschool together, and we used to hold hands and skip out to the playground. She's the greatest walker in the universe, and if you've never done a walk and talk with Sharon Kane, next time you see her at a conference, say, let's go for a walk in the morning. She knows more about young adult literature than any human being on this planet, and I love her to death. Shout out to Oswego in Central New York. Wonderful. So welcome everybody. We're going to just jump in because we only have 20 minutes. We're just fist fighting in the background over who is going to share our screens. And so I'm going to try it right now and see if it works. And are you seeing, what are you seeing? Are you seeing Padlet? Are you seeing, you are? Okay. So let me just.
Yeah, Brian, you have the sharing capabilities.
Okay, well, I know that, but sometimes what happens with me is I can't see my notes that I'm trying to do. And so I'm gonna hand it over. I can't see my notes, so I have no idea where I'm supposed to begin. All right, so I'm gonna go like this. You guys are gonna see my notes, right? Hi, Suze.
Hi.
All right. So we're going to start like this. We are going to go pedagogical. We're not going to necessarily go academic, although we could. Melanie just set it up perfectly for us because she's a National Writing Project guru as well. And we follow the National Writing Project model all the way, which is always about writing with teachers and writing with students and having great mentor texts and seeing yourself as a writer. I direct a project site in Connecticut. I did the Louisville Writing Project, and Susan directs in Pensacola, the Emerald Coast Writing Project. And I'm going to start out with, if you have not read Matt Delapena's Milo Imagines the World, it's a children's book. It's beautifully illustrated by Christian Robinson. At the very end, these are the lines, and it's poetic. His sister rushes to give her a hug before pulling Milo in too. And it's in this tight tangle of familiar arms that he feels most alive. And this presentation came together because one, Susan and I bond over our friendship with Matt Delapena, but two, when Milo Imagines the World was, I knew it was first coming out, the title alone helped me to see that that's how I wanted to reimagine my school year. And so I called Susan, and Susan helped me to imagine this crazy world of COVID all year. And like, she kept me sane, and she was the familiar arms that showed love to help me tolerate this craziness. And Susan, we were in Texas at the North Texas Teen Book Festival when all of this crazy stuff happened. And we came home and we were stuck at home. And wow, we had just come off of, we were presenting on Superman by Matt Delapena and Hope Nation edited by Rose Brock, because we did collaborative work. And so I needed her to pad my craziness. And so when I asked her what she was doing for the summer, she said she created a Padlet for an advanced institute. And I was like, what the heck is Padlet? And she showed me, and I'm gonna go to her session right now and let her talk a little bit about, there we are. Oh, actually, while I'm sharing the screen, all right, that's us. These are padding metaphors. One, right? If you're riding a bike, you need some cushion, right? For your tushy, right? There's one way to pad. Two, you have a notepad that you can take notes. It's awesome to put your seeds and your ideas. Three, we needed a landing pad this year and to put our ideas. And four, we also needed a padded room to help each other keep sane. And so those are all padding metaphors for Padlet and allowed us to come up with our padding our rooms with young adult lit. So there we are. And I'm going to this. Susan, take over.
Okay, so like Bryan was saying, it was June and I realized we were going nowhere and going nowhere very fast because we could not go into a crowded auditorium, but I still wanted to host a summer institute. And, my main goal, and I'm known as the book dealer, my main goal with the National Writing Project is to provide those mentor texts that Melanie so well spoke about for teachers, the quality young adult and children's books to use as mentor texts to help model instruction for students. And Melanie gave you guys some great examples. But how do you do that when you're stuck at home? Well, okay, Bryan, there you go. One of our daily events is to write in the day. And not only do I do this with my students at the university level, and I did this with my students when I taught K-12, but we do this with the pre-service and in-service teachers. And Padlet allowed us to do that. You'll see this column here where I would give them their write in the day. It would either be me reading from a book, me giving them something to think about. Then we would Zoom in together and we were able to share our writing. And for those of the teachers that couldn't make that particular write in the day, at least they had a visual image of that. They felt like they were part of the group. And I'm going to tell you, I think you all know this past year, we have needed to feel that sense of connection. And, I was really concerned about how to do that. And Padlet was really the answer there. Another way that I used Padlet for the Institute was by letting us share our ideas. I get books coming at me. These are the ones that came today. I have 6 boxes of books today.
Thank you,
And I know. And I am a 54-year-old white woman, obviously. This Padlet allowed for all of us to come together, the diverse voices of our community, and share books. Bryan, can you go over to where Deb Richmond's is? I had teacher consultants come in and do book reviews like I did through video. They did, if they didn't feel comfortable doing it in video, they would type about the books. And, Jacqueline Woodson said something one time that I will never forget. And it's about what is diversity. Diversity is all of us coming together, figuring out how to walk through this world together. And as a National Writing Project talking head, they always were listening to me, and this Padlet allowed them to hear from each other. And I'm at the university and I might find a great book that I love, but these teachers know what books are working with the students. So what better way than to use Padlet for that? And Deb and several of the others had their own, column in the Padlet. They were able to make videos again, or they could write reviews. But then the third way that I used it that I loved, and there are many ways, we're going to share the Padlet with you so that you can see this, is through author visits. My teachers, they decide for the 3-week institute what the theme will be. And they decided that this year it was going to be brave. And I love that. Their community, they said, with COVID and everything else that's going on in society, we need to be brave. And I found James Bird's book. He's a new author. I contacted him and I had several authors do small book talks for the teachers or address the teachers about our theme. And so surprisingly, the Institute got rave reviews because the teachers were able to share what they were doing that was working during that time in the classroom. Authors were able to share their young adult books and we were able to come together. And I think that's what's very important.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, and so I didn't know anything about Padlet. And when I talked to Susan, I was like, okay, so teach me how to do it. She's like, Bryan, just go on there. It's click and drag, click and drag, click and drag. Well, I was running a national park grant where teachers from Connecticut were going to go to Ware Farm National Historical Park. But we all of a sudden, we couldn't meet in person. We couldn't go hiking together. So we opened up the applications to people all over the country. And I worked with a teacher who just finished his PhD at Columbia named Richard Novak. And this was my first Padlet. We created reading landscapes and writing nature. And what I loved about it is every day Rich could put his notes that he wanted. The rangers at the park could add the stuff that they wanted everyone to see. We had places where there were resources, and we used Nick Shuri's, or Nick Stone, sorry, Nick, if she was listening to me, she'd laugh. We use Shuri because I'm a huge fan of Wakanda, and I knew that her book was coming out about the younger sister, and it is probably a middle school YA novel, late elementary, and it ironically had a very interesting environmental theme, which was the focus of the reading landscapes. And we interviewed Nick for The Right Time. She was interviewed here by New York Public Library about Shuri, so we used that as a resource. But then we were also able to put our writing prompts from the summer and write together. And that was fascinating to me because people were from California, they were writing from Michigan. And I was like, this really works. You could see my dog got a lot of airtime. And then we did our presentations all from online. And I was like, this is kind of cool. And so I thanked Susan. I was like, this is kind of a neat thing. And then I asked her, have you used it in courses, right? And of course, she's like, yeah, I've organized all my online courses for teaching this year using Padlet. And so do you want to talk about your English education methods?
Yes, I do. I really, for those of you that are in higher ed, and it doesn't have to be higher ed, it can work with K-12 as well. I organized a Padlet, and I always, for the past few years have been using Gallagher and Kittle's 180 days. And so we had a writing venue with our reflections notebook. We had the textbook that we were using. But then I was able to also provide those read alouds to model instruction for them, and then organize the Padlet by modules. You can, and that's what's wonderful about Padlet. You can organize it any way you want to organize it. You have your little guest speakers like Jason Reynolds, and there's so much of that now online that, will really give kids, an authentic voice. When you have Jason Reynolds reading from Ghost, what's better than that? And using those as mentor text, as Melanie spoke about in the last session, showing them ideas for writers' notebooks, showing them picture books that can be used with young adults.
By the way, Susan sent me The Rough Patch by Bryan Lies right after my dog passed away. And now I have a new puppy because I had to get a new one because The Rough Patch was the perfect book for anybody who needs to, grab that rainbow and get another dog. Yeah.
And I think that's what I love about this most is the sense of community. I only can read so many thousands of books, and I do, but then the students start getting involved and they start creating, like you see there with the stick figure, they create stick figures when they're reading Poet X or whatever wonderful YA novel that they found to read. And I give them choice and they love it. And then they start dealing these books to each other, which is absolutely phenomenal. You can't get any better than that. They continue their reading journey. So what I had the students do in response was create their own Padlet after I modeled that. So Bryan, if you can show them the other one, I put outputs. Here is Tabitha Welch's. I got permission from her to share her Padlet, and the students could organize it any way they wanted. I gave them that choice, and I'm glad I did, because there was a lot of variety and a lot of good ideas that were being generated there. Tabitha started thinking about what she wanted to teach her for each 9-week period based on 180 days. and started organizing that, started gathering resources that she wants to use in her class, how she's going to teach certain things, how she's going to recognize her students, how to connect with her students, and just started making her Padlet so that, she has a collection of goodies as she goes into the classroom as a first-year teacher. And then they shared these with one another. And this is when I was so proud. Mama Duck was so proud. They decided to make a Google Drive and include all of their Padlets from my English Ed class to share with one another so that they had unlimited resources. And that's what it's all about, people.
And the one thing that I could add to that, because I could show you, I have an example of one of my courses, Extending Literacy, and it really communicates. Padlet does a good job communicating with Google Classroom and especially Jamboard. And I'm not going to, because of time's sake, I'm not going to show you, but we did, like, everybody read independently. And just one day on demand, 15 minutes, they created a Jamboard. And it was just amazing to see how quickly resources were shared. But we know we were running out of time, and we wanted to highlight two other things that we've been able to use Padlet for this year in our professional work. And one of them is with, professional development with teachers. And so a local high school, one of the poorest performing high schools in the state of Connecticut, received a grant and asked me if I would do professional development with them. And I used Milo Imagines the World, hence the theme. And we asked these high school teachers in all content areas, how can you reimagine the school year when students return next year? And they started thinking about how a children's books could unite all content areas. And so part of the PD was like, how would you read Milo Imagines the World as a gym teacher? How would you read it as a history teacher? How would you read it as an art teacher? Like, where else could you explore? I put a dialogue book in there, which was a great way to get people talking about the books that we bring in. And it turned out really, really well. And I was rolling the die like everybody on this call right now, because I didn't know if the PD would work. I didn't see any of the teachers. It was 18 hours of me like this, and then never seeing them except for when they were in breakout rooms. And one of the best things that I did is I did a kickoff survey to get feedback so I could find out a little bit about them. What was the best look for your presenter today? Here are some of the looks that I told them. I personally like COVID hair, don't care. But what I learned from doing the survey on this is that this school, the 100 and so teachers, rated their PD as a 1 or 2 out of 5 in all their career. But after the PD doing it through Padlet online in digital space, 95% of them rated it a 4 or 5. And I was like, okay, so what is it that I am doing that is different than the PD that they usually get? And I think the answer is the National Writing Project. We have them writing, we have them thinking, we're sharing mentor texts, we're involving them as best as we can. And so the last thing that we wanted to highlight is Susan and I, just recently, we finished hosting a Writing Our Lives conference, which Marcel Haddix at Syracuse University and I started, which are youth conferences, which are just like what we're doing here, but they're for kids. And we both ironically use Padlet to present to our section of kids. And so I'm going to go to Susan. She's going to talk a little bit about what she presented. We have 2 minutes, my friend.
Okay. So very quickly, I just came up with some mentor texts that I want. Well, like Melanie said, you want to think, what do you want the kids to be able to do? And I wanted them to, write and love writing and listen about some really good books. And I use Jason Reynolds' For Everyone because that's a great letter to himself and a letter to all of us. And I had the kids write a letter to themselves, their future selves. And then I found a resource online. It's called Future Me, where students can actually write these letters and they come back to them 5 years later. The letter does. 10 years later, 15 years later. So I just created a Padlet for them to have the resources that I used, the strategies that I taught them, and the books that I used, and some writing activities. And they loved it. They were all writing. The teacher was very excited about that.
Yeah. And so with that whole day, we had 6 presenters from 6 different states presenting to kids. And then we would swap around. It was really, really kind of awesome. And the kids were allowed to each attend 2 sessions. We also have additional sources. Right now, my phone's ringing and nobody ever calls me. So let me just tell these people, sorry, I can't talk right now. And so on here is the National Writing Project if you want more information about them. But we also started this year, it's called The Right Time. And a National Writing Project teacher and a young adult author are brought together in interview about their books. And we've done everybody from, Lori Holtz Andrews into Kwame Alexander, Candace Elo, I mentioned earlier. I mean, we're just
Susan got to interview Jeff Zentner, so she was very excited.
Yes,
about
you did,
that.
Jeff. Yeah, and we've been doing this. We're booked all the way to next summer with people lined up every other week. It's pretty amazing. I guess the only other thing we wanted to say here, I was just going to show you, like in the presentation that I did, and my presentation's in there if you want to like steal ideas, I have no problem with that. Is that I broke it up, just sort of like was mentioned by Melanie in her session. Like these were some of the model texts. I just took one page from them, and I did a workshop where they brainstormed lots of ideas, and then we read all of these things, just a page from each. The Gilded Ones, The Talk by Wade and Cheryl Hudson, Kate and Wading, A Most Beautiful Thing, which modeled different genres of writing. And the kids could choose whatever way they wanted to respond to the day by writing in that fashion. And then we had an open mic at the end. And of course, when you have 140 kids who want to share, you run out of time really, really quick. The only final like thoughts that I just want to make, we have conclusions that we came up with, and this is all pun intended, right? Padlet was a sure thing to create a national community for writing together. The case of Ware Farm. Padlet helped us to become digital Cassius Clays by jabbing punches with cool tools across our courses. Padlet helped us to share a feather or two with teachers during district and school-wide professional development. And Padlet helped us to provide writing instruction for everyone during Writing Our Lives conferences. And I've been telling all my professional friends that I'm good with this. I don't necessarily ever have to go back to in-person teaching, although I think there's benefits to it, but I'm absolutely in awe how this has been effective. So COVID-19 was rough, but it was also reawakening, right? Sort of like the first time I met Sharon Kane and we held hands swinging on the swing set. And then she told me, I don't love you, Bryan. I love Steve Bickmore.
Well, I think we better stop right there, Bryan.
Okay.
You might tell too much. So I noticed in the chat that Steve Bickmore has asked for a private lesson on how to use Padlet. And I just want to say that if he'll let me in that session, then he can stop feeling old because he will feel relatively young. So anybody else who wants to sign up for the session, I think that Bryan and Susan have now a new job, professional development.
Yeah, it's
in terms of
Susan said just click and drag, click and drag, click and drag.
okay.
I'm technologically challenged, so if I can do it, anybody can. And now Melanie, this is a way we can collaborate that we've never thought of before, even within the National Writing Project, and sharing books. And I mean, it's limitless in my mind. So. Special thank you to the teachers for what you've done this past year. You are my heroes, and I just can't imagine. So thank you for that. I just wanted to end with that.
Okay.
This has been great. Can I make a comment? And there's time for questions still, but
yeah,
this is another great pairing to have Melanie with these guys. And we're really pleased at how often these pairings work out well, but it's amazing. So Susan and Bryan, we might talk about pulling your segment out as a separate video and putting it on Dr. Bickmore's Why Wednesday with some conversations about how to use Padlet in advanced ways, right? I mean, because you're doing it, it may be simple to you, but your organization is really pretty beyond what most of us, I think, have done.
We should, I mean, Susan and I, we got on Zoom and I start talking and then she typed what I was saying and she starts talking and I type what we're saying, because this is kind of data collection for people who are, if you have doc students in here trying to figure out, because we're trying to name what it is that happened this year. And one of the things that I realize is if you have good pedagogy, like if you've gone through a good English education program or a teacher program, it's about planning backwards. And Susan's the one who said it. She's like, we knew what our end goals were, and we started curating a museum. It's like a filing cabinet that's visual that you can click to real quick and teach with, and the students can go back and refer to it. Now, Padlet might not last forever, but it's there now, and it takes like text that we see on PowerPoint, and it all of a sudden makes it come alive. And so.
No, this is a session that I'm going to strongly recommend. I have a class that wraps around this. This is one that I'm going to make them look at if they haven't done, because Melanie, you know, is a godsend of information around mentor text and doing all these things. And what you guys have done with this is amazing. So I'll let others ask questions, because I know how to contact all three of you.
And you will.
Okay, so Steve took my answer. I was busy trying to bring the two presentations together, but he's already done that. So thanks, Steve. But I just want to say, in both sessions, I can tell that you're wonderful writing teachers because who engage your students, because as I was listening, I really am not a multitasker. I was really focusing, but part of me wanted to start writing haiku. I looked at some of those texts and I wanted to just, I could try that out. So I think that was just marvelous. Does anyone in the audience have a question for any of the presenters? You can type it in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself and ask. Do any of you have recommendations of young adult books that we should read, that we should put on our summer reading list right now?
Oh, goodness. Ooh.
Sharon, I'm just going to share a text that I totally forgot about. But we worked with online with Padlet with our elementary school programs last year too. And I forgot that I sent this to Susan, and she had it in her advanced institute. This was a 4th grade kid, A.2. He was from Eritrea. He was just in the country for 2 years. And this is a model that came out of the writing. And I love this. It's one of the best pieces I've read all year. The time I got number 2 on my body by A.2. Stink, as in terrible stink, as in the smell stays on your clothes even after you wash them, stink. If the cow poops on you, you will need new clothes immediately, otherwise nobody will like you. My grandparents are the only ones who know how to reverse the stink. They have a special trick to solve the problem. Go outside and play, A.2, my parents told me. I saw the cows and instantly wanted to play with them. Semhar, Abel, and Robel all went with me outside. When Robel took his eyes off of me, I went to get my toy by the cow's bottom. Unfortunately, the cow did number 2 on me, but luckily not on my hair. 6 baths later, I still smelled. My parents didn't know what to do at first. Bleach, water, and soap solved the problem. Not bad for a kid in the country for only a couple of years. All right.
Another mentor text.
It
Thank
is,
you
and I've
so
never
much.
thought I would read. I've not had that. I've never had cow dump on me. Yeah.
New questions?
No questions. I'm reading all these like great books that are being dropped in. Randy Ripley.
Yeah.
All the best mentor texts. All the best mentor texts.
Oh,
It's
Got
scary
another
to
one.
ask me what people should read, because I'm a book a day reader. So on any given day, I may have 5 books for you. So
yeah, me too. I was thinking the same thing. And I'm reading 2 right now. I'm reading A.S. King's new book, and I'm reading The Talk, which is authors
good.
and Bryan actually recommended that to me. And we're actually doing a group, a parent group, and we're reading that in a not very diverse community. So I'm very glad that they have chosen for us to read that.
Well, and Susan and I, we didn't say this, but we're very deliberate. Both of us are white. This conference tends to be very white. Our pedagogy practices tend to be very white. And if you notice, we are very intentional in representing diverse voices in all of our work and making sure that multiple voices are heard with the student populations that we work with and the teacher populations, so that the colonial whiteness doesn't keep getting recreated for the elbow patched AP English teachers amongst us, because we're not reaching the American population the way we should. And I put in there "Call Me American" by Abdi Nur Iftin. He's been on NPR. He's won awards. They just adapted that book for teen readers, and I interviewed him last night for the Right Time. When I tell you, it is a book that makes you think about what it means to be human. It's so good. Yeah, he's up
Well,
by.
Melanie, there we go. More cha-ching, cha-ching.
Yeah, now the
Rack up those books.
the time is up. Ding, 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 ding.
Thank you all for coming.
That was a fast hour. Nice me seeing you again, Melanie, Sharon.
Yep. Thanks, everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Layla.
Great. So many good ideas.